Good evening, everyone. We're going to be talking about the portion of Mishpotim, and it is a very filled portion of mitzvahs. It has more mitzvahs in it than any other portion of the Torah. In fact, the total number is 53 commandments, mainly the civil code of how we ought to behave to one another as human beings. So we're going to go through a summary as we always do, and then we'll come back to dealing with some of the details in more detail. Just mute everybody. Yeah, please, everyone can mute yourselves. Sorry, guys, if you can just mute yourselves. Thank you. So we're going to talk about the summary. It begins by talking about the civil code. If a person happens to have a slave, we'll come back to Joy. Joy, if you can mute yourself. I'm sorry, I keep trying. If you can mute yourself, Joy, thank you. So it speaks about a situation where, God forbid, somebody has taken on a slave. It's not something that is advisable, but we'll see that there are so many rules that relate to how one has to look after one's slave that the Gemara eventually ends off by saying that if a person buys themselves a slave, they're in fact buying themselves a master. They have more responsibilities than they have the benefit of having a slave. So let's go through some of the details. A Jewish slave who is only sold into servitude if the person cannot pay back debts, or if the person, God forbid, stole and cannot restore the money that he stole. So then rather than just putting him to languish in a jail, he's put into a situation where he can pay off the debt. But if he does put himself into that situation, it's for 6 years max. At the end of 6 years, he has to be set free. If the servant says, Ahavti et Adoni, I actually love my master, I want to stay a slave. So me good. I'm actually being well looked after. We're going to talk about some of the details that are required to look after a slave. So he wants to stay on. So we speak about what happens then, is that he's taken to the doorpost and there's his ear, which heard the words from Sinai, not to be a slave to any other than to Hashem. So he's held accountable in the doorway, and then he stays on all the way till Yovel, which is the 50 years of Jubilee, not 50 years since he was sold into slavery, 50 years independent cycle of his sale into servitude. But that is how there is definitely an end. He's not to be a slave forever. Then speaks about a husband's obligation to his wife. There are numerous obligations. Moving along from all different civil codes, punishment for murder, manslaughter, kidnapping, God forbid, abusing parents, penalties accrued by a person who injures another person. So in addition to having to restore the damage, there's other things such as medical expenses and embarrassment and the time that a person has been denied being able to go to work. So there's all of those calculations that are made as well. What happens if somebody does not cause harm himself, but one of his possessions causes harm, like his ox, or he built a pit in the public domain and somebody trips and falls into it, or arson, etc. So we are considered responsible for that which happens through our possessions. A person who steals is liable to pay the capital amount plus punitive damages, the various additional fines that are added to the capital amount that the person stole. Person's right to self-defense when facing a thief. If somebody is burrowing into your home and you have to stand up and defend yourself, you do have rights to defend yourself. Laws regarding a guardian of another person's possession. What happens if a person paid you to look after items, or you're looking after their items without taking payment, or you borrowed an item, or you hired something from somebody else? All of those situations would have different ramifications if, for example, the item was stolen, or it was the negligence, or was it difficult for the person to protect. Obviously, if you're being paid to look after somebody's possessions, you have more responsibilities when it comes to the item having been stolen or lost. Then it speaks about sorcery, bestiality, and offering to an idolatrous sacrifice. Prohibitions against harassing a foreigner, a widow, and an orphan. That's a set that we see again and again, and it refers to people who are vulnerable. A foreigner doesn't have roots in the community, doesn't have stability and strength, doesn't have people to watch out for him or her, a widow gone through a painful loss and is now more vulnerable than others, obviously an orphan, doesn't have parents, so we have even more responsibility to look after their needs. Rushing along the summary, mitzvah of lending money to the poor and the prohibition against lending with interest. So it says, Im kesef talveh, we'll come back to that verse, if you will make a loan to somebody who is in need of finance. But the Gemara learns it's not if, as we normally understand the word if you want to. If you don't want to, you don't have to. You actually have a mitzvah. There's a mitzvah to help a person by lending their money so that you can hold them up before they fall, and then you don't have to have them collecting tzedakah. And when we do lend money, which is an obligation, we're not allowed to take interest from a Jew. The prohibition against cursing a judge or a leader, the prohibition against consuming meat that was not shechted, was not prepared and slaughtered in the Jewish appropriate way. An animal sacrifice has to be older than 8 days old. You never bring an animal as a sacrifice unless it has been through 8 days. Prohibition against perjury, judicial corruption, don't lie, don't take bribes. A whole section that talks about how the law operates with honesty and integrity. Responsibility to give agricultural tithes in their proper order. So we talk about gifts. It's quite interesting how it's all mixed together. Legal responsibilities, damages, and now tzedakah all come together because our property rights and our responsibilities are all very much together. And interesting, in Jewish law, the laws of tzedakah also are dealt with pretty much in the laws of nezikin, the laws of damages, the laws of financial damage, because we have absolute responsibilities not only to have integrity relating to somebody else's property, but to give. We have a responsibility to give. We have to sanctify the firstborn son, and also in animals. Then it speaks about returning a lost animal to its owner. It also speaks about an animal that's falling under its load, and you shall not turn a blind eye, but you shall help the person whose animal it is to lift up the animal from its burden. That's an issue of the person's financial needs, but even more so in this case, the animal that is suffering, and that we have a responsibility to not allow animals, tsar balachayim, not to let animals suffer because of us. Then it speaks about the sabbatical year. 6 years we work, the 7th year is like Shabbos. 6 days we work, the 7th day, once we talk about 6th and 7th, we have to keep Shabbos. So that's also in this week's portion, and it affects all of our property, and what we own as well is affected by Shabbos. We are forbidden to mention the name of other gods. We celebrate 3 festivals, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, the pilgrimage to the Jerusalem, to the temple on those festive moments. We do not cook meat and milk together. If Bnei Israel eradicate idolatry from Israel, then they'll be rewarded with sustenance and health and longevity in the land. But we have to live in the land appropriately. We have to live with the right kind of responsibilities as Jews, and therefore we cannot be involved with idolatry. Hashem warns Bnei Israel against entering into treaties with the lands, with the nations that lived in the land, the Canaanites. That was not meant to be a treaty. I'm sorry, I'm just going to try and mute everybody again. Please try and keep your mute buttons on so we don't hear you. Then Hashem warns Bnei Israel. Okay, number 24, Matan Torah. Moshe communicates to Hashem's message to Bnei Israel, and they passionately agreed. And they said the words, we will do and we will learn. Famous words, Naaseh v'nishma, we will do even before we know and understand what it is we have to do. Our commitment is here. We're ready to do. Now Hashem tells us what to do. That is how ready we are. It's not dependent on whether it fits into our lifestyle or whether it's comfortable. It is a total commitment. Moshe would receive the Torah after being on the mountain for 40 days. That's a summary of pretty much what's happening in this week's portion. We're going to talk about some of the details, and this Shabbat we actually have 2 Torahs taken out, being that we are the Shabbat before the month, the advent of the month of Adar. So we read the portion of Shekalim, which hopefully we'll have time to deal with as well. A 2nd Torah this week, and it's one of 4 special portions leading up to the festival of Pesach. Not every week, but over the next weeks, there'll be 4 occasions when we take out 2 Torahs. This is the first of the 4. So what I really want to talk about, and it's very, very central to the whole theme of this week's portion, is one letter. In English, it's a word. In Hebrew, it's just a prefix, and. The words of this week's portion begin, Ve'ele hamishpatim, and these are the laws which you will set before them. What does it need to have a conjunction and? You would normally start a sentence, Ele hamishpatim, these are the laws. So the commentaries explain a conjunction means that you're connecting this and that. These laws are connected to what happened previously. What happened previously in last week's portion? We had the story of Revelation. We stood at Sinai. It was the holiest moment since creation itself, when Hashem descended on the mountain and said, these are the duties, responsibilities, the most spiritual, uplifting, religious experience. And these are the laws which are set before them, the civil laws. The rabbis say, Ma elu mi Sinai, just like the laws that relate to the lofty ideals of the Ten Commandments, and I am the Lord your God, and you'll love God, and all the things that we speak about on the highest levels come from Sinai. So too, our civil laws also come from Sinai. And we actually have three categories of mitzvahs, three types of laws. We have chukim, we have mishpatim, we have edot. And what are these three? The first one, chukim, are the laws that we could not possibly understand. They are beyond human comprehension. For example, the most important example of mitzvahs that we don't understand is we have to take the ashes of a red heifer and sprinkle it on somebody who had come into contact with the dead, and that purified the person who was previously not pure. And at the same moment, the Kohen who administered the ashes, who was previously tahor, pure, became impure by virtue of the same ashes. Even Shlomo HaMelech said, I don't understand. I cannot understand how these laws operate because they're beyond human comprehension. That's one category of mitzvah where Hashem gives us a law and we don't understand what it is at all. But the bottom line is we follow Hashem's law. Then there's a middle category of laws which we might not have thought of on our own, but once Hashem gave it to us, there is enough logical reason to want to do the mitzvah. For example, Hashem said, eat matzah on Pesach. We wouldn't necessarily have thought of eating matzah on Pesach ourselves. It came from God. It wasn't something we understood. But once it's explained that we are connecting historically, and this is what the Jewish people did, and we're reliving the experience, we can relate to the fact that we should tell the story of Mitzrayim, even though it came from God, not from us. We can relate to it. So that's a middle category that isn't initiated by human comprehension, but it is understood. It can be understood by human intellect. And then you have a third category, which is the kind of laws that every country and every civilization would initiate. Do not murder, do not steal, honor your parents. Those are basic functions of society that even a society that's not religious would embrace and does embrace. And countries around the world speak about laws and rules that protect people's finance and money and ensure that people are not hurt and maimed verbally or physically. So these are laws that we not only could understand, we would initiate them without God. Comes the Torah and says, and these are the laws which were set before you. These laws, the third category, the ones that you understand, the one that you could initiate yourself, the ones that you don't need God for because you would understand it from your own experience in this world, from a Jewish point of view. And these are the laws, these civil, understandable, practical, regular laws that are in every single constitution, or should be. From a Jewish point of view, they are rooted in Sinai. They're rooted in a religious experience with God. That's why we don't murder, and that's why we don't steal. Not just because we understand. And the question is why? Why do we need to have a protection of these mitzvahs that they come from Sinai, they come from God, and we can't root these laws in our own understanding, in our own approach to living? And the answer, of course, is that society has seen too many times civilizations that one would have expected to act in an uplifted and in a way that we could make human beings proud, and they descended into horrific states of just muting everybody. Please keep your mute buttons off, because otherwise we hear you. We're trying to make sure we don't. So these countries descended into terrible situations of disregard of other people. And we need nothing less than our understanding of what happened to our people during the Holocaust and where that happened and who were the initiators of the final solution against our people. The Germans were known for Höflichkeit. They were supposedly a polite people. They were supposedly a people who had all kinds of rules and regulations that determined society, more so than many other nations. And a nation that was so surrounded by laws, human laws, that dictated things like cruelty to animals. These were countries that spoke about not having shechita and not slaughtering animals because they protected the prevention of cruelty against animals. You would think that this would be the safest arena for human beings to live, because these people were committed. They were absolutely committed to a system of rules and regulations. What happens with human beings, however, is that we have a capacity to subjectively explain why, under certain circumstances, the rules that we normally adhere to don't apply. And in the case of Yamach Shemam, may their memory be blotted out, the Nazis, they simply termed the Jews vermin. And the Jews were the reason and the cause for all the problems of Europe. And that's why they were suffering in Germany. So the Jews were not killed, they were exterminated. They rewrote the understanding of murder. And before you knew it, it became not only acceptable, it became a whole system of murder. We've got to be very careful when human beings become the arbiters and the protectors of what is considered justice and just behavior between human beings. We are just much too subjective. And when it comes to subjectivity, we can explain lots of things. The discussion, even in modern days, which is something that is quite controversial and close to people's minds, and the many details surrounding these laws. But if you take the whole concept of abortion and the reasons that the abortion is allowed in some places up till birth, and for reasons other than, God forbid, rape, and very broadly, very liberally allowed to happen, is because everything that is considered relates to the mother, and every person should have a right to make decisions that relate to their own being, and no person should stipulate about another person's body. And that sounds very logical. That sounds something that all of us could think we should embrace. But there is another detail in the whole equation, and that is that there is a living child, unborn but living, with limbs and with heartbeat and with all kinds of details. And if, God forbid, the abortion is performed literally up till the moment of birth, then you're dividing by a minute. You're saying this minute it's doing something of a kindness, and the minute later it's murder. Human beings have to get their heads around some of these abnormal definitions, and people push the bar the whole time. So we would say that under extreme circumstances, and certainly if there's a threat to the life of the mother, and under extreme situations, there would be a reason to ensure that there is an abortion. But when it's applied liberally, without any limitations whatsoever, and what one sees in play is human beings using their own subjective logic to begin to explain why something that they would otherwise say is despicable becomes a mitzvah. Why do we need our laws to come from Sinai? Because if we allow civil law to be rooted in what human beings think and feel, human beings change their attitudes. And laws are formed by society's practices rather than society living up to an absolute right and wrong. Everything becomes subjective. And with time, before you know it, even those things that were holy to society are no longer considered important at all. The Mishnah tells us, the Gemara tells us that if it wasn't for the fact that the Torah taught us that we shouldn't steal, we could have learned not to steal from an ant, because ants are very respectful of each other's property. If you watch an army of ants walking, and one direction they're going empty-handed, and the other direction they're coming carrying a huge burden, sometimes as big as their own body, that they're carrying to their nest, you don't ever see an ant going out of line and holding up the poor ant that's already spent a lot of time getting there and saying, I want your property. I'm not going all the way to pick up my own. I'm going to take yours. No, ants are very, very respectful, and they accept that there is ownership by another. So the Gemara says, if it wasn't for the fact that the Torah told us not to steal, we could have looked at nature, and we could have looked at the world and the way the world operates, and we could have learned not to steal from an ant. We could have learned tzniut, which is modesty, and that we should retain a dignity and a privacy when it comes to matters that are close to one's own being. We could have learned it from a cat. A cat is very modest. Before it relieves itself, it makes sure to dig a hole, and it covers, and it makes sure that it is very discreet in performing functions, bodily functions, that we could learn from. Even if the Torah didn't tell us to be modest, we could have learned from a cat. So the obvious question is, so then why? Why is it that the Torah has to tell us these rules? We could have learned it from an ant. And the answer is that it's true that an ant will never steal from another ant from its own colony. But as soon as an ant sees another colony, they will pulverize, destroy, and raid every element of it. They'll take anything and everything from another colony. There's no respect of property at all. It works when the system works for it in its own nest. But relating to somebody else's, to another ant colony's nest, they have no respect whatsoever. We could have learned from an ant, but then we always would have retained the elements of subjectivity of when we apply it, when it suits us, when we don't apply it, when it doesn't suit us. We need to know that it's rooted in Sinai, in a God and in a system that completely transcends our understanding. Even the things we do understand, we don't do them because of our understanding. We do them because they came from Sinai. A cat is a very modest creature, true. But if you interview the mouse in the house relating to the cat's activities, the mouse will tell you that the feline is a ferocious creature that will play with you until death. It has disregard for life completely. So the purry, cute little cat in one set of circumstances becomes ferocious in another. We have to surrender to a system that is bigger than ourselves. And that is a beautiful connection between last Shabbat and Sinai and the civil code and the civil law. And many of the laws actually talk about kindness, caring, compassion. And all of those, again, are rooted not in the fact that I feel kind at this moment. Surely we have to acquire those attributes. We have to acquire attributes of kindness. We should emulate God's kindness. We should want to act kind. But it shouldn't be a practice that is based on whether we're in the mood or not in the mood, or whether we feel like it, or whether we like that person or not like that person. Kindness has to be across the board. My daughter Shana just sent me a very powerful story, which I read just before the shir, and it related to LaGuardia, one of the mayors of New York City, and it took place in the time of the Depression. And there was a terrible situation where a woman was standing in front of the judge, and the mayor of the city said to the judge, "You go home, I'll preside over the court's details tonight." And the case that came before the mayor of the city was a woman, and she had stolen a loaf of bread. And the fine for stealing was $10 or so many weeks in prison. And the mayor, now acting as the judge, turned to the woman and he said, why did you steal the bread? She said, I did. Why did you steal the bread? Because my daughter's husband left her, and my daughter's ill, and I have 2 grandchildren, and they have no food. And if I did not take this bread, they would die. So I know that I did something wrong, but this is the reason that I did it. And the mayor turned to the person whose bread was stolen and said, under the circumstances, do you still want to lay charges? And he said, we have to, because it's a very bad neighborhood. And if we don't set an example, then people won't respect the law, and we have to. We have to set the example, and we got to make sure that she pays the price and that she's sentenced to whatever it is. And the mayor listened and said, under those circumstances, the law is the law. I fine you $10. And he reached into his own wallet and he presented the woman with $10 to pay her fine. And then he turned to the courtroom and he said, and I fine every person present in the courtroom 50 cents each, because I fine you because you live in a city in which a grandmother doesn't have food to feed her grandchildren. And society accepts this. And we live here. And look what's happening around us. I find us all, including that we pay 50 cents as an acknowledgement of something wrong with society if we live in such a place and we're not sensitive to the needs of a widow, a grandmother who doesn't have food for her grandchildren. And everybody in the courtroom paid up to 50 cents, and that came to like $45, which they paid over to a woman who is now getting rich out of the events in the courtroom. And one can imagine the sense, the feeling, the weight of people understanding that there's law and there's a rule and there's legal requirements, and there's also the compassion and the kindness and the recognition that we are children of Hashem and we need to care for one another. And we're going to go through many of the commandments from this week's portion that talk about it. So we said that the first thing it talks about is purchasing a slave. We've already given the context of a slave being sold. The person stole, the person or did damage and cannot restore money to the owner. So rather than just putting the person in jail and then nobody benefits, or certainly the person who lost the money doesn't gain, and now this person's just wallowing in jail, it's not the sentence that we have in Judaism, but we say that the person who gets sold so that he can restore the damages, can pay back the loan, and then it's also only for a limited period of time. And Ibn Ezra says there's nothing more difficult for a person than to be subjugated to another human being. This is why the Pasha begins with the laws of how the Hebrew slave is to be treated. So it actually starts by talking about the most vulnerable of human beings, the person who is a slave, the person who has very little rights and can be just destroyed by societal rules and regulations. The person has nothing to really defend him or herself with. It starts with that most downtrodden sector of society and says, we have huge responsibilities to make sure that this slave, this vulnerable slave, is taken care of. So we can't do harsh labor. You can't just decide that the person is going to do labor that has no benefit. It has to be productive. You cannot humiliate a person and say, do work that is humiliating. You eat together with your slave, eats at your table. The living conditions have to reflect your own, not slave or servants' rooms at the back that have no correlation with the way we live in our homes. That there is a correlation. The furniture, the lifestyle comes to Jewish slave. Medical responsibilities, total responsibility for that person to be taken care of. Responsibility to their family. So much so that the Talmud ends off and says, if you buy yourself a slave, we're not advocating that. But if you do buy a slave, you've actually bought yourself a master because you have more responsibilities than you have rights. And whilst we think it's strange that civil code would deal with slavery, it's not advocating slavery. It's talking about the rights and responsibilities and the compassion that a person has to have to even a person who has been sold into slavery because they made a mistake. They stole or they did damage, and this is the only way they can restore the money that they owe. Don't take advantage of this person. You have to look after them to such an extent that they become, in a sense, your master. So if he says, because of that, I love my master, I'm actually happier to live as a slave than to leave and risk not being able to support my family. Here, he takes care of my medical bills, takes care of my family, feeds me food. I live in a very beautiful conditions. I actually don't want to go. That is the extent to which we would think, why would a person ever choose slavery? But that is the extent that he is taken care of. So if he says, I have to Adoni, I love my master, I don't want to go home, don't want to go free. So you bring him to the doorpost of your home and you perforate his ear. We say specifically it happens in the doorway, because doorway is the threshold to freedom. Remember, when it came to us leaving Egypt, we sprinkled the blood of the Paschal offering on our doorways. That was the doorway represents the archway that exists between being slaves and being free. You take him to that point and you say, you're in the doorway. You're in the place that is able to usher you into freedom. Don't do it. Go free. But if you don't, then you'll be he has his ear perforated in the doorway of decision. And we say to him, the ear that heard at Sinai, that we are servants of God, not servants of other people. And here you elect to be a slave of another human being, something's wrong. And then there's a numerical value that the Martzeya, which is the ore with which one makes the whole, is the same numerical value of 400, which reminds of the 400 years of slavery in Egypt. So we actually tell the slave, think about what you're doing. You are electing, you are choosing to be a slave. We all know that the origin of our people began with emancipating slaves, not with slaves choosing to want to be a slave. Okay, what happens if a person is walking the way and he's liable for any damage that he causes, whether he does it inadvertently, willfully, whether he was drunk, whether he was awake, whether he was asleep. So if he blind, so he's responsible. You can't say, I'm not responsible because I was sleeping, I didn't know. I did it without, you didn't know, but you're accountable for what you do. You're a human being. You're responsible in all situations. If he blinded his neighbor's eye or broke his articles, full compensation has to be made. We know that when it says in this week's portion, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it doesn't mean the actual eye. It means the monetary damage that is caused by having lost that limb. Not only does he have to pay for the loss of value in the person as a result of the injury, he has to pay for the loss of work, and he should fully heal him. He has to, from Yatz Derive, okay, there's an additional thing that we learn. From Yatz Derive, and he shall fully heal him. From here we learn, says the Gemara, that a physician is allowed to heal a person who's sick. Because it could be argued, why should I get involved as a doctor to heal somebody who's sick? God made the person sick. I'm interfering with God's plan on earth. Hashem decided that he'll be sick, and I'm coming now to do something against God's plan. You could say. So this verse tells you that Hashem says, you have a responsibility to heal. Whatever the person's condition, maybe God made that happen for whatever reason. That is never an excuse for us not to get involved. We have a responsibility to uplift, to help, to assist, not only the doctor doing medical procedures, but any human being who has a capacity to lift up and to assist another human being should never hide behind the fact that, why is it my problem? God decided that the person is in this terrible situation, so I don't want to get involved. We do. We have to get involved. We know that an eye for an eye is not the actual eye itself. The Talmud proves it. It's monetary compensation. It's interesting from the Vilna Gaon, if you go, the letters under Ayin, Yud, and a Nun, the letters just beneath them are Kaf, Samach, and Pei. The letters just beneath those letters spell Kesef. So the Vilna Gaon says it's actually hidden in the code of the word, that the word Ayin and the letters just beneath them. The next letter after Yud is a Chaf, and the next Yud after Ayin is a Pei, and the next Yud after Nun is a Mem. So you actually have, is the Chaf and the Samach and the Pei. Ayin is the Pei, Yud is the Chaf, and Nun is the Samach. So the Tachat underneath the Ayin is really the word Kesef, which spells money. That's a financial obligation. We speak about 4 different types of guardians. We did it briefly. There's an unpaid guardian, a borrower, a person who is paid to be a guardian, and then a renter. So in each of these situations, there is a different level of responsibility. For example, the unpaid guardian just swears on everything and is absolved. If he says somebody stole it, and they came into my property and stole it, he has to swear that something was stolen, and then he's not responsible because he's an unpaid guardian. But if he's a paid guardian, then he does have to put up barbed wire and fences to make sure that it doesn't get stolen. I am now on the last tether of my load shedding, but maybe we're going to be able to get through the last few moments. Let's see if we can. What happens if you see an ox that is even of your enemy? So not only a person an ox of somebody who is your friend, it's an ox of somebody who is your enemy. You don't like that person. You nevertheless have a responsibility. If you see his item lost,